It's the 16th of July, 2012. We're in Stellenbosch, South Africa, about 50 kilometers out of Cape Town, where there's a very cold winter outside. And I'm being very honored to be with Professor Ampie Muller, who has been an academic in his own right, a radio raconteur, and conflict resolution person who worked alongside Javier van der Merwe, the person we'd like to discuss this morning, as a parent of the peace and conflict resolution field, specifically for his work in South Africa. Ampie, if I may call you that.
You may, please.
Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview about the life and times of Javier van der Merwe.
You're welcome.
Ampie, so how should I understand the life and time of Javier van der Merwe? What qualifies him to be a parent of the field in South Africa?
Yanni, that's not an easy question. For the simple reason he worked on I've known him for 30 years in that field.
Mm-hmm.
When he started out, concepts like conflict resolution and mediation and so on were, in a sense, in South Africa almost foreign. You know, a couple of people in Europe, perhaps here and there in the United States, but people in England, very few people really talked about it, almost a science of conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
So Javi came in and he started working, and perhaps I should put it like this: Javi's existence was a mediating existence. He tried to bring people together, and through his integrity, his commitment, and his honesty, he actually brought people who otherwise would not have been talking to one another in a very difficult South Africa together. And he kept on doing that for 30 years until he retired from the center and then went over to USIP to do a year or two there.
Mm-hmm. Would he have framed it as a mediating existence? Or did he
No, he wouldn't have known the term.
Mm-hmm.
The terms are things that came later.
Mm-hmm.
His thing was actually just getting people to talk to one another. That was really what he would have called that.
So he was involved for 30 years, about 68, 92, with the Center for Intergroup Studies in Cape Town, previously known by another name. But before we even get there, set the scene for me about the then South Africa, 1968. What was South Africa then, and a difficult place, and for someone to start work in this field?
Yanni, yeah. Now, after the Second World War, the big figure in South Africa was General Smuts,
Mm-hmm.
who lost his seat in the election of 1948.
Mm-hmm.
The Afrikaners came into power and immediately decided they're going to make a South Africa that suited their philosophy, their hang-ups, their feeling about race relations, etc. They came in the first years, actually. They came up with things like the Mixed Marriages Act. In other words, people of different races were not allowed, as they called it, races, were not allowed to get married to one another or be intimate with one another.
This was after the 48 election, in
It was
which
after the 48 election.
the Nationalist Party came in.
Yeah, the Nationalist Party came in. That was the party of Afrikaans people, put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
They came in with the Immorality Act,
Mm-hmm.
which meant not get married, but can't get actually in any relationship with one another. And the Separate Amenities Act. In other words, people couldn't use the same amenities, which eventually became quite difficult for the center when we wanted to bring people together. So that was the idea, that was the scene, that there was a hardening of attitudes from all sides. Immediately people of color in South Africa, and I'm using that advisedly, because in South Africa, it's not just or that time, people were talking about white and non-white peoples. In other words, in the negative of the white was good, the negative was not good. And so therefore it became eventually that we talked about black people, colored people, and Indian people as the so-called non-white people. But therefore there was a hardening of attitudes on the one side, from both sides actually. The people were criticized from all over the world, the nationalist government, for what they've been doing, so they hardened in their position, this is right, they even decided that being strongly Calvinistic people, that was the will of the Lord, that was the Bible said. They bent the Bible to become a sort of, almost say, a ventriloquist doll and speak to them in terms of things that they wanted from the Bible. And so therefore there was a very strong feeling that people of races don't mix, they don't talk to one another except in the position of boss and labourer. And so when Harvey came in '68, you can understand that this was not an easy period for getting people to talk to one another.
So clearly, Amri, those were difficult days for someone like Javier to start working at the Center for Intergroup Studies, which we'll discuss later, as a place for bringing people together. Javier was clearly ahead of his time. These notions were not welcomed.
No, they weren't generally appreciated, they weren't welcomed, they weren't very prevalent. There were small groups of people doing different little things here and there, trying to bring people together, etc., etc. But what Harvey was doing was actually not, it was unheard of in those days.
So in his memoir, Peacemaking in South Africa, A Life in Conflict Resolution, what was fascinating to me is that he grew up in what was an extremely conservative, if I may, racist situation, and was a racist for many years in the beginning himself. Is that fair?
No doubt. He came from a very small town in a rural area. His father was a farmer. They believed in all the, almost let me put it, hang-ups that the nationalists were suffering from, that not that black people were necessarily bad, but they were not equal to white people, and therefore you never would greet them by hand. You refer to them in different terms. A woman was not just a woman, she was a maid, or the man a gardener, or a worker, or something like that. They were definitely not on equal terms. So in other words, from that background, and Harvey was brought up in that, and he bought it completely.
As were many
As,
other
oh yeah,
brothers.
all as matter of fact, most people, with few exceptions, that was the prevalent emotional and political background that he grew up in. And although he then, so strange that he actually didn't even want to become educated. He did in his first sort of years until he was 10. He went to a little farm school where all 26 people were in the same classroom, from standard sub A, the first standard, to standard 6, the 8th standard. And after that he went to the town, it was by bus to the town Bonneville, where he grew up in, to the school, and after standard 6 he wanted to come home and farm. And the headmaster of the school and the dominie of the church came and talked to his father into letting him go on to do the high school, which he did. But after matric he immediately said, now I've had enough and I'm now going to work. And he saw an advertisement somewhere for a farming type to come to the mission field in Mashonaland, that was the southern part of the old Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where the Dutch Reformed Church had a mission station, and they wanted a farmer to help them in their work. He went up there, where he travelled around on horseback, on cycle, etc., with a big 9.3 Moser gun, because he also saw himself as a big game hunter, which never happened. He sometimes shot buck for the people to have meat and so on. But it's still there. He worked very well with these people. He was a very amenable, nice individual, but he could never greet them by hand.
Really?
And so he came back from there after 2 years and decided now he's going to Stellenbosch University, where he went to do a BA in social work originally, because he felt that's the thing he likes to do, help people, etc., etc. And then came in contact with a number of people that had an enormous impact on him. The professor of sociology, S.P. Soulier, was a well-known, enlightened individual. Benny Kitt, a professor of theology, was violently against, not violently, was definitely against the prevalent ideas of the Calvinist Dutch Reformed Church. He didn't believe that the Bible sanctioned apartheid. And then a philosopher, Johannes Degenaar, in a very soft-spoken, Socratic way, questioned all these ideas of the South African government and the people supporting it. And so Harvey then, while he was there, what he was doing his honours and later his masters, became a different individual. He became very different, very enlightened. He started questioning his own people on the farm, much to their irritation. He met his first wife, or his wife, not his first wife, his wife there, and her family came from the Free State, also in a very conservative environment. He questioned them about their attitudes to black people, to labourers, to things like that. And so he then realized that there's no way that he'll be able to live comfortably in an Afrikaans environment. Although the English people were not necessarily less racist, there was actually not beholden to the government. There was not so much pressure on them than was on the Afrikaans-speaking South Africans. So he accepted the job at Rhodes University, where he started his academic life.
So take us from Rhodes to the A. Bailey Foundation and to 1968 when he joined the Center for Intergroup Studies, and how that whole transition came about.
Yeah. While he was at Rhodes, he had an sort of lectureship there in sociology. He saw an advertisement at the Cape Town University, or not the Cape Town University, at Cape Town University there was an institute, the A. Bailey Institute for Interracial Studies. And I must actually just mention that racist meant in this case meant the Afrikaans and English speaking white people. It was not meant to be black and any other body. So in other words, that was their idea, to bring greater harmony. It's almost harking back to 1910, and since then there was the attempt to bring the two big white groups together.
Interesting.
So he then actually, and the idea was then to do this, and he joined them. And although he didn't start work immediately, because he had worked at Rhodes University for 5 years without long leave, they granted him long leave, and he went to America for in '69, came back in 1970, and then started working. He still had some work left from the ideas of white elites in South Africa, what they were thinking and so on, and that book was finished in 1974. But in 73, 71, he brought together what's perhaps groundbreaking attempt at bringing people in South Africa together. He succeeded in bringing the three student groups in South Africa, black students, English-speaking students, and Afrikaans-speaking students together. The black students being represented by Steve Biko, became quite a famous name in South Africa, died in '76 when he was actually murdered by the previous regime. He and Barney Pichana, also both of them belonging to the South African Students' Organization, and Barney became the rector of the University of South Africa eventually, in later years after '94, one of the biggest universities in South Africa. Neville Curtis, who represented the English-speaking students in South Africa under the banner of the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS, and the ASB, Johan Fick, who was a past president of the Afrikaanse Studentenbond, the Afrikaner Student Association.
All names that became famous.
All became famous and well known in South Africa. And he brought them together for a discussion, which was a very successful discussion. And so that, in a sense, was an attempt at a time when it was not acceptable to do things like this. They were being watched by the secret police while they were doing it. And even to the extent that he found out after the first day that he had a call from jail by Steve Biko and Barney Pichana that they've been arrested for being in a white area overnight. Because in terms of the laws at the time, they weren't allowed to stay there. They could visit during the day, but they couldn't stay overnight.
You've done so, but tell us a little bit about just how extraordinary that work was for that time and how difficult it was to do so.
Yeah. Well, as I've said, it was not acceptable. So most people, fortunately it was in a university environment. It wasn't so widely, in Afrikaans press didn't perhaps know about it, or widely publicized as one today would have been. And so in a sense, you could get away with it. But if it wasn't, there would have been criticism from every side. Remember, one of the big things I believe in bringing people together is that you must remember that Steve Biko and his side had constituents who believe you shouldn't talk to the other side. You distrust them, and therefore whatever they do, they're trying to to gain, superiority over you by getting you involved in a thing where you're actually the lesser party.
Wasn't that notion also very much part of Afrikanerdom?
That was a very, very strong part of Afrikanerdom from the other side, therefore. But also, therefore, seeing that they distrusted the black people, or the black political organizations, put it like that, therefore you didn't speak to these people. They're all trying to gain, ascendancy over you, to put it like that. And the Afrikaner want to get somebody like Johan Fick to talk to these people was also something. He had his own constituents, and if it was widely known, he might have been discarded as their representative, to put it like that. So in a sense, it's almost as in those days you had to do it in private, you had to do it secretly. And although it wasn't, Harvey, the one thing about Harvey is, I think the reason why they came, said that Harvey exuded a feeling of integrity. They believed he was there. He was not trying to get the better of them. He was not trying to use them. He was trying to get a discussion going. And in that sense, I think this is the reason why they came, and why they stayed, and why they phoned him to get them out of jail and so on. Because that meeting went on after that. He had to find accommodation for them elsewhere, so they wouldn't be under the same sort of problems as the previous day or previous evening. But that, I think, is one of the things that it was unheard of. It was something not easily happened, and that was right at the beginning of his occupancy of this position of the representative of the A. Bailey Trust for Interracial Studies.
Now, so you're saying it has something to do with his personality and style.
Yeah.
If I may just segue to some personal contact I had with him as an example of something. I knew him during my days in radio and television in South Africa, and once had to talk the head of Afrikaans news, public affairs programming, into interviewing him, although he was going to be interviewed by Wimpie de Klerk, brother of then or later President de Klerk.
Yeah.
They were very unhappy and very distrustful of having him on television.
Yeah.
At the same time, when I visited him for the first time from overseas in 1989, he said to me, "Were you followed?" And I said, "Was I followed?" And he said, "Were you followed? Because you have to understand, Jannie, if you visit me, you're on the list of the security police."
Yeah.
And I laughed and I said, if you're in television or a journalist in South Africa, you probably already were there, but it made me understand what a price he was paying for this work he was doing. Did that affect him personally?
Let me put it like that. I think, in a sense, it strengthened his commitment to the task of creating a better South Africa. He lived very early on. And he said it also at a meeting, I think 1973, when there was again talk that black people should be ousted from the Western Cape, they don't belong there. There's an ice line somewhere in the Eastern Cape behind which they should stay, and back in the Transkei and so on. And he said then, I've been in the Cape for 9 years, and black people who've been here for much longer have more right to be here than I have to be here. So in other words, right there, he was stating the case for an equality between people. We have rights in South Africa, and they are South Africans, and for that reason they should be treated like South Africans.
Not arguments that would have gone down with the government or Afrikaners at the time.
Very definitely not.
Yeah.
But in any case, I think also at the same time when one does that, you get so much support from the people opposing the government that become eventually your home. And that gives you the succor and support that you need to be able to carry on doing that.
We're also discussing to a degree the moral fiber of what someone needs to do this kind of work under very difficult circumstances. He got some of that strength from the Quakers. Give us that history.
Well, Harvey was a strong believer, and therefore he belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, and he didn't leave them, although he differed from them. He tried to, as the old saying would say, trying to change them from the inside. Yes. And he noticed when he was an elder in the church, of the Dutch Reformed Church in Rondebosch, where he was situated then when he joined the Cape Town University, situated in the suburb of Rondebosch, and he belonged to the Rondebosch Church as an elder. And he noticed very quickly that he's not making much headway in trying to get the church to accept that what they're doing is wrong. And so at the same time, traveling overseas, having contact with people, he met Quakers. And he started learning from Quakers what they were doing, etc., etc. And in 1976, he became what is known in the Quaker movement as a Quaker by convincement. He believed it was the right thing to do. And the Quaker had, one of the things they're against violence. They don't go to war, they try to do other things during wars, etc., etc. And so Harvey's own thing was that he's working for peace. But peace without justice is not tenable. There's no future. In other words, if you try to create a peace where justice is not present, then what invariably happens is that the weaker party pays an enormous price for that peace. Not the stronger party, the weak party. And that for that reason you have to build into your attempts at getting a peaceful settlement justice. And I think that is perhaps the overriding philosophy in the life of Harvey. That gave him the courage, that gave him the commitment, that gave him everything that was necessary. He believed in that, believed fervently in that. He was a Quaker till the end of his days, and a very good Quaker. He was clerk of the Quakers in Cape Town. He helped to start the Quaker peace movement. That was also a Quaker sort of movement that worked in the same sort of field. So everything that he does was informed to a large extent by him being a Quaker.
Quakerism informed his work, but how did he frame it? Did he see himself as a third party, as a mediator, how did he see
I think
this?
perhaps just as a peacemaker, but just the peacemaker with the proviso of justice seeker at the same time.
You referred to Justice and Peace. He wrote the book, which is possibly his biggest contribution to theory in the field, Pursuing Justice and Peace. How should one then understand, to a degree, the philosophy of his work? How did he understand that?
I think to a large extent it is taken up in that book, although that's not the only one. I think perhaps even more so, there was an article not only written by him, but by a group of us in the Center for Intergroup Studies, which the Bailey Institute eventually became in 1973, when he convinced the elders in the organization to recall it the Center for Intergroup Studies, that it also included people of color. And so for that reason he went on.
That was the change.
Yeah, that was the change. And then in this article that we wrote about, under Harvey's guidance, that was him trying to express what he really felt about it. He was not a philosopher in the strict sense of the word. It was an article on principles of communication in conflict, which was later taken up in one of the collections of John Burton at George Mason University. And in that really 33 principles, I think it set out to a large extent all the intricacies of doing that. The fact is that if you communicate, you have to communicate with integrity, you have to accept both parties as genuine parties in the field, that you have to make sure that you don't disempower the weaker party by going for justice at all costs, and say actually there should be never in any circumstances be violence. He said actually the power that violence gives is sometimes the only power that the weaker party may possess. And by robbing them of that, you actually say to the stronger party, you're the boss. You're going to vanquish the other one, and they're going to land up without any peace or justice. And so therefore I think that is the kernel or the crux of his approach to the whole thing, if one would call it that. Simple principle that peace without justice is untenable. It has no future. The peace that you create in that way never lasts. It is a temporary thing, and that therefore if you want to create real peace, you have to have a peace with justice.
A mediator then technically he was not.
Not in the sense in which the movement eventually became a technical term. You know, you have an advocate, you have an advocate, you're an activist, you have your third party roles, as we say when we teach people about this. No, he wasn't. his life, his existence was a mediating one. He was really trying with all the integrity and all the honesty and all the commitment in him to create a space where people could meet and feel safe in that meeting. So no, he really was looking for a real communication, authentic communication between people. Because as you know, that's the one thing that suffers when there's conflict, is that immediately authentic communication stops and you start getting propaganda. You so bad, no, you so bad, you're the cause, etc., etc. And his thing was trying to see, is it possible at all to create a space where people could really communicate with one another? Not just talk, but communicate.
Ampi, I was very touched by your presentation on Javier at the IACM, International Association of Conflict Management conference that was just held here in Africa. Actually the first time in Stellenbosch, first time in Africa this past week. But one of the things that struck me by the other presenters was how they all were touched personally by their association with Javier in terms of their future work. But what I want to focus on just for the moment is that they did also refer to Javier as a very distant human being at times, and that what he did was, rather than becoming involved in third-party work himself, in a sense facilitated that by creating circumstances by which other people would do it, and then he would sit back and actually go sit in his office. Fair?
Yeah, no, it's fair, absolutely a fair evaluation of what Harvey was. As I said before, Harvey was not a trained mediator. He didn't ask the right questions, he didn't know what to do as far as that is concerned. His main task was trying to get groups to talk to one another. His main task to get what we call authentic communication. And as you know, in conflict, the minute conflict starts, authentic communication is out of the window. People start shouting propaganda at one another, you bad, no, you're the one, you're the cause, etc., etc. And so Harvey thought, he believed strongly that if he can get people to really communicate with one another, and to be able to do that, you have to create an atmosphere of trust. And I think his integrity, the fact that he worked openly, that he never lied to them, that he never, not to any party, that he would inform the secret police of what he's doing, although they thought he was stupid and he was taken in by these people, etc. He persisted in doing that, and so he would therefore bring them together. But as you said, he would then make sure that he had somebody else to do this. I saw it right through the 80s. We, for example, started we decided we must have a South African association for people working in the field of conflict. And we decided that we're going to suggest at the Sociological Association, where he helped them, to create a certain chapter called CAPS, Conflict and Peace Studies. In one of the meetings, that we must have a steering committee to create the atmosphere, the constitution, etc., for a South African Association of Conflict Intervention. He then suggested me as chair, because he knew I'd be able to do that better than he would be able to do that. And the next year we took back that constitution, we accepted it, and he became the first president of that. But the president is not the one who does the work, he's just a figurehead. And that was Harvey's position. So not of being the figurehead, but being somebody that has facilitated something which we thought was important. And also we decided right at the start that the centre can start something, but it must push it out immediately. The simple reason we didn't have enough staff to be able to run it from the inside. And that we did in many, many different instances. We started in Soweto, the southwestern townships in Johannesburg, the black townships, in the middle 80s. The Negotiation Skills Project. And that was actually, we got a group that worked, American and South African group, to create a 3-day course in negotiating skills. And we were going to teach black youth, who was very rebellious in the middle 80s. They were fighting, throwing stones, being shot by the police, etc., etc. We were trying to empower them by teaching them how to negotiate. And the Negotiating Skills Project was started there at one of their centers, the Funda Center, Funda meaning learning. And I again was the chairman of that organization, but Harvey was the one, the idea, who started this idea. And so right through the organization, when we started to have the big training event in '89, with 5 American top trainers, James Lowy, Wilbur Tapchik, Chris Moore, Margaret Galton, and so on. He was the again behind, but he let me and Val Dovey be the organizers of that sort of thing. So yes, he was always the one that got the idea, got it going, but know that he was not the man to be able to run with it. And that is in a sense why he was a facilitator of all these different activities, not the executor.
You referred to the '89 visit from George Mason with the late, much loved Jim Lowy,
Yeah.
Chris Moore, Wilbur Dobchik, etc. So a picture of that last night in Andries Odendahl's home. Everybody looking much younger than they are today.
Yes, they were.
Love the picture. But there were other examples of how Javier facilitated this kind of work by bringing in expertise from all kinds of places.
Even in his work with the ANC, for example, Javier decided very early on that the ANC must talk to people in South Africa. The ANC was in exile at the moment. They were in Lusaka mostly. That was their sort of base, although they were all over the world. Some of them lived in London, some, here and there. But he actually decided to take people there. But he would take people that he thought could further the aims of communication. He himself just stood in as the individual whose integrity would give a guarantee that that you're not wasting your time when you come with me to Lusaka. He took a journalist in '84, to Piet Miller, to work there, who first came from an Afrikaans newspaper and said very strongly in a leader shortly afterwards, the government should be talking to the ANC, which was unheard of in those days. But it wasn't Javier. He brought other people that he knew had the expertise to do that. And you can see that in many instances, almost all the instances, he was the one. And we visited the security police, the top of the police of different sections. We saw the ministers of law and order, etc., to ask permission to do certain things, to try and explain why it was a bad thing to ban a meeting when Govan Mbeki came out of Robben Island and the people want to fake his arrival in the real world again, etc. But all the time, it was only his integrity and his commitment that he was sharing with them. He was not going to do it. He was going to get other people to train people in non-violent ways of having meetings, things like that, and in training marshals, in doing things like that. And that went right through his life.
But part of the strategy clearly was to be extremely open in a very divided society about what he did, and to build acceptance, especially with the government and the security police, and also with the ANC and their divided factions, for the fact that this needed to happen.
Yeah, no doubt. Harvey knew that he himself is an insignificant figure as far as that is concerned. He doesn't represent anybody. So if he doesn't take people there that have constituents here who will be worthwhile in the future in the aims of a peace in South Africa, it was going to lead nowhere. So in other words, Harvey then, although he in his figure represented and guaranteed people who wanted to go there, again, the safety of doing that, he never did it himself. It was always this idea that if I go there, I guarantee to the people in the ANC and the other side that what I do will be, and I must tell you beforehand, I'm going to tell the secret police what I'm doing. I'm going to show the people what I'm doing. I'm not hiding it, because that means they will shut us down very, very quickly. So in all cases, and it was interesting, although the government stopped some of the people, especially the government people that he wanted to take, like Wynand Malan and Leon Wessel, who became a minister eventually, a student group from Stellenbosch who wanted to go there. He took their P.V. Botha took their passports away, and we can go on and on and on.
Former Minister of P.V. Botha.
He was president at the time. He took their passports away. We got people, say, like St. Peter Blans and Willie Esterhuizen, that we wanted to take, which we knew were close to the government, were academics and so on. And again, PW said, we don't talk to terrorists and murderers and so on, but he did it openly. And And by doing it, everybody was aware of the fact. And it actually highlighted the fact there were great differences of opinion within the government. Security groups, the police security versus the army security versus internal relations and so on. And so in a sense, by them almost say fighting one another, it was possible for RV and the centre to move between them to get to their goal.
And it seemed to me that what you're saying is extreme openness on both sides. Here's what's going to happen, is to a degree what made him non-threatening to everybody.
Yeah. And why they was allowed, when everybody else's passports were taken away, they could have taken our passports away, and they never did. So we went, met, came back, and the interesting thing was that people from the government, although I don't think that the President Botha knew about it at the time, like Kobie Coetzee, who was Minister of Justice, came to see us afterwards. They would ask, what did they say? What's going on there? And we would therefore be able to say to them, going back again, this is what the government
So
thinks.
in a sense, you and him were passing messages along from one side to the other.
Yeah, that was what we believe, genuine messages from genuine people. So it is not actually, we believe that the government feels this, that and the other. We can say, yes, we had a visit there, and that's what it was. We can say, we saw Thabo Mbeki, we saw so-and-so in Lusaka, and that is what they said.
And you played a role that they couldn't play for each other.
Yeah, they couldn't do it for one another. And again, it was the integrity of Harvey that helped him. And Harvey, while at those meetings, I was present in some of them in Lusaka, he wouldn't say much. The other people that he took would be saying this. It was his presence that made it possible for people to go there. But he was not the one to do it himself.
Mainly he was there to bring them together.
Yeah, he was mainly there to bring them together.
Is it also fair to say that he was a strong believer in the issue of being an insider neutral, that he wanted to be impartial, but he thought that this had to be done not by external people, but by insider South Africans?
Yeah. He believed very strongly that people had to know what is going on. By knowing not just intellectually, you should have lived with the answers, put it like that. In other words, growing up in a country is different from learning from a textbook, this is what's going on.
Internal knowledge.
Internal knowledge. And therefore, in a sense, yes, very, very strongly had the idea that if you wanted to do that, and again, to come back to the terms that you used there, impartial, he believed that as far as mediation is concerned, a mediator cannot always be neutral, because as far as values are concerned, we cannot be neutral. You believe in certain things, and if you believe, you're not neutral. But you can be impartial and say, fine, in spite of the fact that I differ from you, in this case, I'm not going to favor the one side above the other side. I'm going to create the table, you talk to one another, and it's between what happens between you that actually will lead to the outcome, not what I do and what I say.
Not an easy message in those days to give to either the government or the ANC.
No, it was very difficult. And as I say, again, I think the fact that it's his integrity and his feeling of trust in himself and in both the parties that made it possible.
Tell me something about the how-to handbook, the Purple Shall Govern.
Interesting that in one of the, and the Purple Shall Govern is a handbook that actually tells people of non-violent ways of opposing.
How did that come about?
It came about because of the fact that in the 80s and in the 70s there was an enormous lot of rebellion. There was an enormous lot of work where people threw stones, did this, did that and the other thing. And in a sense many people got shot because the government always had more power, and more, not power but force, if I may use the term by Hannah Arendt, that actually power comes from the consent of the people and force comes from the battle of the gun. So the government had the force, the battle of the gun. They could force people to do this, that and the other. And in one of these, how should I put it, ventures of students against, or not students, all people against the government into the field near Parliament. They were sort of protesting. And the government came out with water cannon mixed with purple dye, with the idea of, if we spray that, we'll be able to see later who were the people that actually were the perpetrators. And so, therefore, that's what they did. And we decided, or how we decided, let's call this thing the Purple Shall Govern. Those are the people that have been targeted by the government, that were sprayed by this, And in this, he made use of the ideas that people like Chris Moore and others have expounded in America, in the United States, on how to oppose, what are the different ways of opposing in non-violent ways.
In those days, we're talking about the 70s and 80s, the government really didn't allow much negotiating across organizational or color lines about the future of South Africa. But what later developed was, in a sense, negotiation and mediation in the labor field. Was Javier affecting that? Was that work affecting Javier? Tell me that history.
In a sense, they were to start off completely separately. Remember, there were laws actually governing the fact that labor and management had to meet once a year, or once in whatever periods of time, to be able to determine salaries for the coming.
And then we had the Vian Commission.
And then during, and so, but perhaps let me go back a minute, and that was actually the idea, was that they would then determine salaries for the next period.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about the early 70s, 60s and early 70s, 68 and early 70s. And in a sense then, what you always found is that labor were the one side with a position, management on the other side with a position, and then they would actually fight for those positions to the bitter end. They lost millions of rands, and then actually gained very little in the end from both sides. And then the government appointed the Vian Commission. That was a commission that was going to look at the laws governing this relationship between management and labor. And they actually came up in the end of the 70s with much more liberal rules in terms of that engagement. But in those days, it wasn't really seen as mediating in our sense of the word. It was still, management was still stronger than labor. Management had the money, they had the most of the cards in their hands. But in any case, it was accepted that it was legitimate for labor to negotiate, put it like that. And so in a sense, therefore, there was not much influence, so apart from the more favorable circumstances surrounding these negotiations. There was not much influencing of the center or anything like that.
Now, could we say that, in a sense, that was allowed not so much for better race relations, but more in the interest of the economy?
Oh yes, very definitely, purely for the sake of the economy. But it's interesting, when we had this big training session in the end of the 80s, when Jim Lowy and these 5 people from America came, we also sent them around to train labor people.
Interesting.
And in a sense, I think that was followed eventually by things like the IMSA movement, and actually a new approach to mediation between management and labor. So in a sense, we could almost say that it's more an outflow of the work of the center that actually that influenced labor than the other way around.
Just define IMSA.
Yeah.
Independent Mediation Movement in South
Africa.
Africa.
The Independent Mediation Movement in South Africa. It became, still is, very strong center pin in the mediation between government and management. And there are quite a lot of things they do that are very liberal, very modern, etc., etc. But it all grew from the early attempts. From, and the said it was really, power was the main thing involved in up to the middle 80s and so on in these negotiations. And the one had the power, and remember that labor's only power is striking. So we can take away your ability to be able to produce, and therefore we hurt you. One would say we've got money, or the management say we've got money, and by not giving you enough, we have the power. But in a sense, therefore, both of them hurting one another. They needed one another. And in a sense, therefore, the creation of IMSA and the new approach, put it like that I believe came after the late 80s, was actually a new way of saying we both need one another. And to come with positions and not with our interests is not in the interest of neither labor, nor management, nor the economy of South Africa.
By 1970, it is not about me, but I was out of high school. And it was a very divided time. We can't think today what that was like. It's interesting that here, 45 years later, approximately, it's hard to even remember how divided those days were. That must have been a tough job for Javier.
Very, very, very tough. And I say, if it wasn't situated at a university, and also a university that was seen as a liberal university, if he was at an Afrikaans university, it would have been almost impossible to do what he was doing there. Because in other words, I knew at some university that I was at that if people even started, taking interest in, say, for example, the economics of the coloured community or something like that, the people at the top would actually target them. And I know many people who never got their professorships and so on, because they were doing the wrong things. And others, there were very subtle ways of expressing power and expressing displeasure with what people were doing. And that was actually, that was again, perhaps it was a wise choice of Harvey at that time to go to an English university where the government didn't have so much influence. It's not that they were more liberal or anything like that always, but the government had little influence there.
That made me think of something else. I think of many other Afrikaners who became, I'm going to use an Afrikaans word that you will know, verguisde Afrikaners, meaning crushed Afrikaners. Many people, Ben Marais, others, you will give me a longer list, paid terrible prices for their opposition.
Standing up against Pope, yeah.
How did Harvey get away with it?
Yeah, let me say again, the fact is, Paul, can remember that many of these, like Ben Marais, which I knew personally, was from the early 50s. And in those days it was just unheard of. And the people, he also had certain young academics from Pretoria University that, was influenced by him, because he was a very good man, Ben Marais. But when they heard what happened to him and they experienced the force of the government and of the university authorities on them, they very often say, well, it's nice work, but not for us. We're not going to do it any longer. And so therefore, for a long time, very few, all the ones, the few who really did it and ventured into this field, became isolated. And they had to be very strong individuals to take what came their way. And many who would otherwise have ventured into this field became silent. The little groups like Verligte Aksie, United Action and so on, they were small groups of people. And also always targeted by their universities, by their environments, by the police, by the secret police and so on. But again, the fact is that Harvey did it from the start by being completely open with the government. So in a sense, by people knowing that the government knew what he was doing, that actually, I think, obviated the need to express their displeasure with him. And that made him possible for him to, as you call it, to get away with it.
No, I'm just always struck by the fact that there were so many Afrikaners, especially in academia, and religion, who had their careers destroyed for their opposition to apartheid.
No doubt about that. Many. And as I say, it's only the real strong who survived that. Many people, once they experienced the force of public opinion, they became what we call jaarbroers, people yay-sayers all the time, because that was safer. That's the way you can keep your position. That's the way you would be put on committees, things like that. If you opposed, you were out. And that means your future, your position in academia, etc., were influenced by that. So there was a very subtle way in which the government and not only the government, but Afrikaner organizations like the Bilderberg, things like that, which is a secret organization where many of the top people belong to, they would influence whether you were appointed at universities, they would influence whether you could belong to this, that, or the other, in many, many ways. Many people were sidelined. Some of the best people were sidelined in those days. And that actually is an interesting thing that left to a poverty within the government, was people who loyally opposed some of these things were pushed out. So eventually what remained were only the, almost what I can say, the lesser people who agreed at all costs. And therefore they lacked the intelligence, the insight, the whatever, to be able to overcome the problems when it became difficult in the 80s. So they were on a downhill slope, let me put it like that. It was my perception.
Very painful time in the history of the Afrikaner.
Sorry?
Very painful time in the history of the
Very painful time. Well, also big splits. The party split, the conservative groups, Andre Streernet and his groups and things like that, many, Jaap Morais and so on. Many of these people became separate little groupings opposing the government.
So, Javier, you mentioned his early work with the student groups, but his work at the Center for Intergroup Studies, now the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, that became the body that grew out of that. But if I may take you back to Javier and then his early work with the student groups, can you give me some of the highlights of the work that he did to sort of better relationships between South Africans, to prepare the table for what then followed? After that student...
the 71, the meeting between, say, the student groups. The next year had a meeting of 100 people from management and labor that he brought together for the discussion. And through the period leading up to that, he had many different types of people that he brought together in this sort of sense. So people had an opportunity of talking to one another that otherwise would not have talked to one another. But also, and remember, it was not always a mediator, it was also sometimes an activist and participant, or an advocate, put it like that. So in other words, in 73, when there was a student strike at the University of Western Cape, he was an advocate for them. He presented a memorandum to the legal commission that was appointed by the state under Judge Van Wyk. So in 1976 again, when there was the student uprising in Soweto that was well known all around the world, and where the government really came down very hard on the student community, and lots of them were killed and so on. It spilled over to the Cape Town environment, and there were student uprisings here, and revolt and rebellion and so on. And and another commission was appointed, the so-called Judge Slier Commission, where again Javier appeared as an advocate for the students and for what they were doing, presented a memorandum, and appeared before the judge to argue their case and things like that. And in many instances where it happened, he was willing to go. But also it's interesting that at the same time, when people were afraid to do this, in the late 80s there was a student, not late 80s, in the 70s, 80s, that period, there was a rebellion between the younger black people and the older ones, the comrades and the Witdoeke, as they call themselves, the white cloths. Those were the things that the older people had around their heads. And they were really in serious clashes with one another. The older ones were more sympathetic and said, no, don't be so rebellious, we need the money, we need this. And the youngest one said, we can't take that any longer, we have to rebel, even though they cheat and kill us and so on. And so they were in real violent clashes with one another. And he and one of his mates from the Quaker movement went in there by car, when there weren't even police present there.
Very dangerous.
And they saw these people there staying, and Harvey got out and they accepted him to talk there.
Wow.
And said, but it's interesting then, something happened that was very important for him in determining his future course, that he then took the side of one group, and the progressive group. And actually, and that was about June, and he took the sides, and in sort of later in the year, a Quaker friend from America was here, said, Harvey, if you noticed that in June there was still one person left that both parties could talk to. In December there was none. And he suddenly realized that he had actually, by doing that, he destroyed the middle ground. And we then realized the importance that we really thought all the time, that the middle ground, when that is gone, you have conflict that nobody can resolve. There's nobody left to resolve it. And so in a sense, it became after that that he understood the enormously important role of the middle ground in conflicts. And that therefore then he wouldn't, for the whole 80s, and we were actually accused by many of the active parties involved in this, especially the weaker parties, say, why aren't you there? Why were you not in that process? Why weren't you doing this, that and the other? Why weren't you throwing stones? And we said, for that specific reason, that if we did it, there was nobody else in the middle that could actually resolve. For them it was an all-out war, both sides, from the government as well as the opposition. For us then was the thing, if you want to remain a viable and a middle movement with integrity, you cannot destroy the middle ground.
Again, what year were you talking now about?
I'm talking about the middle 80s.
Ladies.
Yeah.
three things that Javier were involved in his book, A Life in Conflict Resolution in South Africa. There's a foreword by Nelson Mandela. So he worked with Winnie Mandela. He facilitated to a degree conversations between Nelson Mandela and the government while Mandela was in jail. And then there was someone else he worked with that I'd like you to talk about, Karel Boshoff.
Yeah, it is interesting, and again it harks all back to the integrity of Javier's approach. He learned about the plight of Winnie Mandela, who was the one member of the Mandela family outside of jail, outside of Robben Island, and therefore the police really targeted her. They banned her to a small little town in the Free State, Brandfort, where she lived in a simple little house. She could only meet one person at a time. That was part of the banning orders for all people, even Beyers Naudé eventually. They could also speak to one person at a time.
The religious leader, Beyers Naudé,
Yeah.
Afrikaner.
Yeah, that eventually became quite a big figure and to have many streets named after him.
Yes, indeed.
But in 1981, they were going through the Free State, and he and his wife, Marieke, decided we're going to visit Winnie in Brandfort. They asked permission, you had to, and it was refused. So they couldn't go. In 82 they passed again, and by the meantime the laws have changed and the people who had to give permission was different ones. The police said no, and they said no, fine, you can go. But remember, she can speak to only one person at a time. So they went to her little house, knocked on the door, and when she came out he spoke to her. And only one person would at a time. Told him, and he said yes, she had received the material that he sent to her about the Center for Intergroup Studies and so on. She didn't know what it was about and why. And he tried to explain a lot, and he tried to give her the background. And then she said, I'd like to speak to your wife. And so Marieke, his wife, went in. And they had a heart-to-heart between women. And that became a regular thing. So the next year, not a regular thing going to Brandfort, she got permission. Nelson Mandela was brought from Robben Island to the Pollsmoor prison. And she could visit him during certain intervals. But she always had to be fetched at the airport by people that the police knew who they were. She had to be taken to the prison. She had to stay at a specific address that they had to know beforehand and so on. And he became the one who fetched her at the airport and took her to the place where she stayed, took her from there to prison, back, etc., etc. But in 1983 he asked permission for her to stay at his house, which was granted. And that's the first time that I met when he was in his house in observatory in Cape Town. And therefore it became, this bond between him and Winnie became much, much closer. And she told him then at the end of 83 that she's told Nelson about him, and Nelson wants to meet him. So he asked permission. First it wasn't granted, but in December of 84 he was given permission to see him. And that's the first time that he went in and he met Nelson Mandela.
And how does one understand what came out of that? What came out of that was positive?
Well, let me tell you what came out of that. In the first place is actually it cemented a bond between the Mandela family. Because then he and Winnie and Nelson were on the same page, if I put it like that. They had children who were getting bigger, and Nelson asked Javier, when his daughters came to Cape Town University, to look after them. He became a sort of, let's say, primus inter pares, a father in the absence of their own father and mother and so on. So it became quite a close bond. And interesting that before he left, when he left prison, he was sent to Victor Verster, another prison in the sort of rural areas close to Cape Town. He invited them over, him and Marieke, to have a meal with him. He had his own house by them, in the prison grounds, with a prison warden looking after that and so on. So it was a very close relationship. But it meant also that therefore they could talk about the future. They could talk about talks and things like that. And he would always, after his talk, would be visited by people like Coetzee and so on, to ask what was discussed, etc., etc. So in a sense, although he didn't, and the centre didn't actually do the go-betweening, because the government wouldn't allow them to do that. They had to use their own people. It would not have been possible without the facilitation that went on over a long period of time, from the early 80s to the late 80s, before the government sent in their own people. By then, the facilitation was done. The ANC believed there was a possibility of reaching accommodation, and so did the people on the national side. And so, in a sense, therefore, I think that his role was then played, and the government could take their own people that they trusted. And even there was differences of opinion between the different parties, what should happen, etc., etc. But in any case, as we know, then it led to negotiations, Kudesa, etc., etc., and that led to the 1994 elections.
So he set the stage for many of those things.
I think he did.
Interesting that you mentioned Mandela, and in sharp contrast to that, then his relationship to Karl Boshoff. Explain that.
Yeah. Now, Karl Boshoff, that again, it's not only Karl Boshoff, I'll try and go into this. Karl Boshoff was a very good man,
Explain.
also a theologian. He was a theologian that actually believed that the Afrikaners couldn't claim that they wanted part of the country without working for it. In other words, he chose then one of the driest parts of the country, Orania, and he created a little country, a little place for right-wing Afrikaners called Orania. Harvey felt that he should get Mandela and him to meet. So after Mandela came out, he arranged a meeting between, and again, because of his integrity, both Karl Boshoff felt safe to meet Mandela, and Mandela felt it was okay to meet Karl Boshoff. And it led eventually, strangely enough, after 94, they had a very good discussion. He understood what Karl Boshoff was doing, and he had very strong sympathy for the people who felt they couldn't live out their dreams and hopes and things in not in a violent community. But also Dr. Verwoerd, who was really seen as the enemy by the ANC, his widow,
The father of apartheid.
yeah, father of apartheid, his widow, Mrs. Verwoerd, was living in Orania because Karl Boshoff's wife was the daughter of Dr. Verwoerd. And he eventually went in, Mandela, and he went in specifically to meet Mrs. Verwoerd and to extend a friendly hand of welcome to her, or friendship to her. So in other words, it led this meetings, because there was another movement of the same kind, when there was an Afrikaner right-wing group called Afstig, that is, let's start our own country, put it like that.
Let's separate.
Yeah, let's a separate one. And he decided, he offered to mediate, or not mediate, facilitate between them and the ANC, who was then already coming into being as the strong and dominant party in the country. And for a year or two they refused Afstig, but eventually said yes. And for the first time then I met Afstig members in Harvey's house, and on the other side people like Dilla Umar, a minister, Kader Asmal, and people like that otherwise would never have been able to meet with one another, meeting on a friendly, homely sort of atmosphere and talking to one another.
So the way that one could understand Harvey's role in this case would be that he created a situation in this meeting between Mandela and Boshoff for conservative, if you will, right-wing Afrikaners to feel that the change would still be safe for them, it wouldn't destroy them.
Yeah, they could actually be part of a new South Africa, where otherwise they would have been, you remember that for a long time, right-wing or more right-wing black movements like in Inkatha didn't want to come into that. They didn't want to vote, they didn't want to be part of the new South Africa. And so the same would have happened with right-wing groups in the white community. And I think Harvey's intervention, Harvey's facilitation, made it possible, not for all groups, but for most of the right-wing groups to say, well, perhaps it is not a lost cause. Perhaps with the ANC we could still talk, and perhaps because their own government wouldn't give them what they wanted, perhaps they could get it under the new government.
So, Ampi, there's a new South Africa. The country has moved on. There's a new constitution. I think one can safely say that Harvey van der Merwe was a patriot, but he was also a pioneer. How should we remember him?
Jannie, yeah, I think back and I'm trying to find an answer to that thing. Because it's always different to say, you know, memory is a strange instrument. What is it that we should remember Harvey for?
Apart from
being a human being, a special sort of human being, because of his integrity. and also because of the causes that he picked up. I mean, I've spoken about it so often, but I must do it again. We must remember him as a man of great integrity, who picked up some causes that other people did not, that was unpopular at the time because of the opposition from government circles, even opposition from opposition circles. That he picked it up, he was not afraid to do so, that he did it with great integrity, and that his great role was that of a facilitator of communication. And that he brought people together that otherwise would never have spoken to one another. And simply because of his personality, his way of approaching things, his honesty and his integrity, they were willing to sit down and talk to one another. And then it was up to them. Remember, he didn't force anything, any direction, anything like that. He just said, I'll create the circumstances for you. I'll create the environment of trust and of acceptance that would make it possible for you to have authentic communication with one another. So in a sense, perhaps in the biggest way, I would say, he was the creator of authentic communication between warring parties.
And as you say, it's easy to, or very hard to remake those times, but a very brave thing to do at the time.
It was incredibly courageous, because as I said, the forces on both sides put against you doing that was considerable and formidable. So in other words, lesser people might have given up. Lesser people did give up. There were people who tried from the early 50s onwards, from the Afrikaner circles to try, even from English guys. And groups of people, very often people felt comfortable by being a group of theologians writing a book, times have changed, we must do this and the other. But the persistence with which Harvey did what he was doing, the fact that he never gave up, that he went on from 68 right through to the 90s when he retired to go to the Peace Institute in New York to do a stint there. He never gave up. He never relented. He was relentless in his pursuit of what he believed should happen to make South Africa a better place for all its inhabitants.
So Harvey was also in many ways the forefather of things that followed. Here in Cape Town, his work led to the Center for Conflict Resolution. There are many mediation institutions now in South Africa, labor and elsewhere, community, family mediation. There's also Vasu Gandon's Accord in Durban that does wonderful work in Africa. Can one say that the Center for Intergroup Relations was the forefather in Harvey's work of all those institutions?
Without a doubt. Not perhaps I can't say all the institutions, but I think it made it possible and enabled a lot of these people. Many of the people you mentioned, Vasu, worked at the center. He was invited by Harvey from America, where he's doing his degree, to come over and stay with us for a short time. And then he left and he started a course, as I say, that worked all over Africa, and today is one of the biggest in the world. But many of the other people that one sees around as individuals who worked, there was somebody like Val Dovey, who came in to help me to have a group of people talking about the influence of violence on children. It was not part of the job of the center, but he allowed me to do things like that. He allowed me to bring out from Northern Ireland a lady who was working in the field of violence on children, Dr. Elizabeth McWhirter, to come here and give seminars at a time when there was an academic boycott. So we were not very popular. We believed the need was so great we had to do on. So that was possible, and it was he who enabled that. But then we had a lot of people, Val Dovey, who only started helping me there, eventually became, almost say, the mother of conflict resolution in schools. And almost a movement that I would have called in those days parenting for peace. In other words, a peace is an attitude that you have to teach people from early on. And that from the primary school, she became involved in teaching teachers how to deal with that in schools, and how to teach children to deal with it in a non-violent and a non-aggressive and a non sort of way. So now that was her sort of move. There were people like Andries Odendaal and Chris Spies, who were members who worked at the center, worked at different sort of projects that we had there. We eventually branched out and worked all over the world. Craig Arnson, who started his own mediation and transformation practice as a mediator, working in small towns all around Boland, where we try to create peace towns by getting the people from the black and white community to talk to one another, to create structures where people could work consistently and in a positive way with one another. And as you said, Vasu's thing has become a very great one in Africa. But the centre itself, the Centre for Conflict Resolution, after he left, also started training. And many of the people that Vasu used today were trained by the centre in those days in conflict resolution techniques. So we brought people in from all over Africa. People like Andries Witnall, for example, went to Lesotho. He speaks Sotho fluently. He went and he trained in Lesotho. And so we also worked in Africa. People like Craig Ardenson worked all over Africa, but all over the world, in the East, in South America, etc., etc. So I think actually that you can find traces of the influence of the centre and therefore Javier in many parts of the world. So I really believe that from that point of view, the sourdough that he released built cakes all over the world.
Ampi, that was a wonderful metaphor. Let me end this interview by talking about you for a minute, if I may. You spent a lot of your time in your life early in radio, worked with Javier for 30 years, that's a long time. You had a wonderful life. What did you get out of it? Your life in conflict resolution, what did you get out of it?
Yannick, let me put it like this. I also from very early on had this urge to actually create a better South Africa. And we know that to do that, we had to get people talking. So before I knew Javier, we created organizations like Verligte Aksie, Enlightened Action, which tried at one stage to get people of color to talk to white people from platforms, etc., etc. Because white people only knew black people as servants, and therefore they couldn't see them as equals. And we tried to get equal, quality, trained, backgrounded people to come and talk to them. And we did it all over the country. And so therefore from that started, that's how I met Javier when I represented the Eastern Province at the meeting in the Cape, when we brought these people of different kinds, the coloured and white people, white Afrikaners together. But we also I was involved in quite a number of these things, but the end product was always trying to get to a place where we would have a better South Africa. So my meeting Javier and my coming down from Wits University to the Cape and working with him as a senior consultant for 21 years, as a matter of fact, that I had the satisfaction of seeing things, satisfaction of seeing a new South Africa, that with all its problems and everything that's happening today, for me, is a far better place than we've had before, in terms of the freedom of people, the liberty of people, the fact that you see people, when we used to know only people, poor people, black people are always poor, you see black children always in rags and tatters, you don't see it anymore. You see young black children being confident of their role, who they are, etc., and seeing a whole future ahead of them. That for me is such a liberating thing for me as a human being, that I believe it made it all worthwhile.
Could you have foreseen that 25, 30 years ago?
No.
You didn't think it
Not
was
at
going to
all.
happen that
We
possible?
hope, but hope on the one side and belief on the other side were not always superimposed. So in a sense, no, I didn't see it happening. We hoped for it and we worked for it, but it was quite a relief when it eventually happened. We didn't see, we thought perhaps another 20, 30 years, people spoke about that. And so 1994 came very suddenly and happily for us.
Many people also predicted a civil war in South Africa.
Yeah, and it happened without that, and I think that to a large extent, people, the integrity of somebody like Nelson Mandela, but for him to operate the way he did, there was also the integrity of Javier van der Merwe.
Ampi Muller, it was an honor to speak to you. Thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you, Yannick.